How much consideration should you give to a person's faith in deciding whether they will be a good fit as a spouse, a business partner, a ministry employee, or volunteer? Should you factor in circumstances or ignore these entirely when you are making significant life decisions? Let's talk about that on today's episode.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back, my friend. We are almost to the end of the book of Nehemiah that we have been trekking through, and we're going to talk about some really interesting things today. But before I dive into that, I just want to say very quickly, do you have some women in your church or your community that need to hear an encouraging message that's more than just another self-care talk? Now, don't get me wrong. We need self-care, and sometimes that might look like simply taking a break or just doing something for ourselves. That has a place and a purpose. But self-care is also about following Christ, which is a call to die to the sins that keep us from becoming our best and true self. So sometimes, we need to slip on those comfy socks and curl up with a movie or a good book or whatever just nourishes our spirit. But sometimes it also means we got to pull in our big girl boots and go muck out the barn, so to speak. If you are looking for a speaker who can come and deliver a message that's encouraging, impactful, and a message of depth, hey, check out my offerings on my website, stephaniepresents.com. I do also consider custom topics. So if you are having a women's event and you already have a theme and you have a topic, or there's a message that your women are really needing, feel free to reach out, check in with me. I make a commitment. I'm never going to speak on a topic that I am not qualified and prepared to speak on. Okay, let's dive into what we're going to talk about today as we are trekking through the book of Nehemiah, and we are in chapter 11. Now, I will be the first to say, when you read chapter 11 of Nehemiah and the first part of chapter 12, it can kind of read like wah, wah, wah. Like, what real significance does this have to me? And I always want to be careful not to put into passages meaning that isn't there. I also want to be careful that I don't just look at the very surface of things, and if something doesn't just fall right off the page, that I think, well, there's nothing there for me. So I think on the surface level, it can kind of seem like there's not much there. But if we really look at what's going on here, I think that there are some significant insights that we can take away and we can apply in our own lives. We can use to share with other people, or we can just file away because there might come a day that we actually need that. So as we've been looking at the book of Nehemiah, and when Nehemiah had gone back and the Jews were rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, and if you're joining us for the first time, then I don't want to repeat all that history. You can go back and listen to other episodes, and best of all, read along with the book with me as we're trekking through these episodes. But Jerusalem was more than just another town. And it was even more than the Jewish cultural and political capital and center. Because it was where the temple was located, or at times when the temple had been destroyed, it was designated as the temple's location. The city also represented the Israelites' relationship with God. You see, the temple was in the Old Testament, the temple was at the time the representation of God's presence on earth. Now, it wasn't that was the only place that God was present at all. God is not finite in his presence in the way that we are, but it represented his presence and especially his relationship with the Jewish people. So the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, it wasn't just to give it a town so it would be safe or to have a place of prestige, and it wasn't just to create an economic hub. it also represented people rebuilding their relationship with God. And this is one reason why, once the physical walls were rebuilt, we see in earlier chapters that people immediately moved into actions that would rebuild their relationship with God as individuals and as a nation. So as we look at this and this chapter here that focuses really on the people that were going to come and populate Jerusalem, it wasn't that nobody lived in Jerusalem, but the vast majority of the Jewish people that were still in the nation of Israel, even though it was totally ruled by a Persian king and it no longer had its own autonomy, Jerusalem was not the place of choice to live. It wasn't like people were lining up and hoping that they would somehow win the lottery and be able to move into Jerusalem. It was kind of like, you want to go live where? Why? But what happened is, once those walls were rebuilt, and it did create a place of some level of safety, then people had to come and live there. I mean, there was going to be work that was going to be needed to be done in the city to protect it and to continue the work of rebuilding. Because once the walls were rebuilt, you still had the inside of the city that needed to rebuild. Houses needed to be built there. There were things that needed to happen with the temple that was there. And this is something that we can look at for ourselves. When we are building or rebuilding a place, and I don't just mean like a physical structure, but I mean a place in terms of a business, a ministry, or even a relationship, who you choose to populate it with matters. And success will require that you have people who come with a willing heart to sacrifice. And you also have people that come who will trust God to direct their lives. You see, what happened in Jerusalem was there were some people who willingly volunteered to go and live in Jerusalem. Make no mistake, this was a sacrifice. Again, it wasn't like, oh, wow, we're going to get to move into this thriving urban center. Or if your dream is more to live out on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't even like, we're going to go move into our dream property. It was a sacrifice that some people made voluntarily, and they lifted their hand and said, hey, we'll move back in there. There were other people who were selected to move back in there by what the Bible calls casting the lot. Now, to understand what this is, this wasn't some magical practice. It was a matter of trusting God. It was actually a way that God had established earlier for people to be able to make decisions. It was a practice that was a matter of faith. So that's what we need to focus on. It was about the faith that people put in God's ability and willingness to cause the dice to fall in a certain way. It wasn't that they were attributing the dice themselves some magical or supernatural or divine powers. The focus was on God and his ability to say, basically, you're going to cast these dice. I mean, that's the equivalent of what we might think of today here in the United States. And then you're going to trust that I'm going to cause those to land exactly the way that they need to land. You know, just because somebody is a believer in Christ doesn't make them qualified to occupy any particular place. And just because you had many people there that had the capacity to go and live in Jerusalem, that didn't mean that they were all qualified to go there. Some of them volunteered, and some of them were selected, again, through faith in God that was, and this time, it was played out in terms of rolling the dice. Again, there wasn't anything magical or supernatural or divine about the dice themselves. It was about trusting that God could cause those to land just as he wanted them to. And this is something that's important for us, because how many times have you seen businesses suffer a partnership or maybe even end because people go into business together simply because they're both Christians? And how many people are hired in faith-based organizations primarily or exclusively because they agree with the statement of faith or the mission statement? And then how many people choose a spouse simply because, oh, they're a believer as well? That is not enough. Agreement in faith at its most fundamental levels, and what I mean by that is what we might write down in a statement of faith, is a starting place. It's not to be our end place. And specifically, we need to consider three aspects in addition to a person's standing before God. We need to consider their character, their credibility, and their competency. So let's kind of dive into those a little bit more. First of all, character. Being a Christian is both about a position and a path. We aren't called into faith in Christ just simply to make a decision. We are called to make a decision and a commitment. And a lot of people make a decision to believe in Jesus, but that is not the same thing as making a commitment to following him. And so Jesus called, and when he was here physically present on earth, he called people both to believe in him and to follow him. It's not one or the other, it's both and. Acknowledging that everyone who believes in Jesus isn't necessarily following him with their whole heart, isn't being judgmental and condemning. Well, I mean, it could be, but it's not always that. Sometimes it's being wise about their character. People will differ in their character even when they hold to the same theological beliefs. Even when people are legitimately Christians, that doesn't mean that their character somehow all evens out all at once. People have different levels of maturity, and it doesn't happen naturally simply because we age. Do you know anybody who you would call an older person, and you look at their level of maturity or their character, and you're like, my goodness, would you please grow up? And then you can look at somebody that's much younger, and we might say, wow, they are wiser beyond their years, because we might look at them and say, wow, they've actually done some work. They're actually more mature in their character than somebody else who is older in terms of their chronological age. Our character is formed partly because of our starting places. And what I mean by that is everybody doesn't have the same experiences in life pre-Christianity, pre their decision to come to Christ, during their growing up. Some people end up at an advanced starting point, and some people don't have that benefit. Years ago, my kids were asking me, well, actually, they were complaining. They were complaining about a person that we knew, and about how they kind of felt like that this person just, was not very mature in who they were as a person. This was an adult. And they weren't being disrespectful. I mean, I had to understand that from their perspectives, they were pretty right on in what they believed and what they saw in this person. But what I had to remind them of was I knew a lot more about this person's history. And it wasn't necessary to sit down and fill them in on everything this person had experienced, but just making the comment to them to say, people start at different places, even as adults. And so there are some times that people have more mature character, say in their early 20s, simply because of the good fortune of how they've been brought up. Other people have experienced things throughout their growing up years, and they kind of have to start and they can work really, really hard just to get to the level of maturity that somebody else kind of starts at. So that is part of what shapes our character. Now, that does not give us an excuse. It should, however, give us some understanding and compassion as we deal with other people. Character is also going to be shaped differently according to people's knowledge and just what they know, and of course, according to their choices. So we want to look, when we are looking at populating, so to speak, a place in our life, whether that's with a spouse, a business partner, an employee, a volunteer, a staff choice that or even our friends actually, that we look at and say, what's this person's character like? And over a period of time, do we see growth in their character or do we see regression? Because here's the thing, and I've said this before, there is no neutral in life. You are either growing or you are decaying. There is no neutral, there's no just even stagnation. The second C that we want to look at is credibility. Does someone have the knowledge and experience that's needed to fill a certain position? Somebody can truly have great character, but that doesn't give them the credibility to occupy any kind of position in your life, in your business, or in your ministry. So we need to look at a person's credibility. What kind of experiences have they had and how have they engaged with those experiences? What levels of knowledge do they have? What levels of knowledge have they had the opportunity to acquire that they have shown themselves to be responsible with, and where have they just said, that's kind of not for me. It's not important, or that kind of thing. So we want to look at a person's character. We want to look at their credibility. And lastly, we want to look at their capacity. Does someone have the ability? Desire is not enough. I recently heard Rich Villodas on the Carrie Newhoff podcast, which, by the way, is a great podcast. So if that's a new podcast for you, definitely want to go and look that up. It's CareyNiewhoff, Carrie Newhoff podcast. And Rich used the phrase theology of limits. And acknowledging that we have limits is an exercise in humility. I might have the character and I might have the credibility to be able to drive a van load of teenagers up to a Bible camp in the mountains of Colorado. But I am the last person that you would ever want to hire for that position or to even accept as a volunteer for that position. And it's something I would never volunteer to do unless I knew exactly what their roads were and I had driven those roads before. Why? Because I cannot drive on those kinds of roads where it's like if you go an inch to the left, or you're going to plunge to your death because there's like 1,000-foot drop off. I just cannot do those kinds of roads. And I have had enough experiences with traveling and trying to do those kinds of roads where I have accepted there is a humility of limits. At some point, it's not just always mind over matter. At some point, it's like, oh yeah, guess what? There's something in your system, in your biological design that's called an auto system. And when it reaches a certain point of internal stress, we are going to make you pass out. And even though I've not had that experience, I have come extremely close to having that experience. And it's very frightening. And that's one of the reasons that I have accepted there is a limit to what I can do in terms of driving. So I might have the character, I might have the credibility. I do not have that capacity. And as we are looking at the people that we invite into our lives, into our organizations, we need to be honest about assessing capacity. And I also want to say that capacity gets lived out in two ways. I think of capacity kind of as an application of honesty. It's being able to honestly assess what I am capable of doing at this point in my life. And that doesn't mean I'm never going to grow my capacity. Capacities can be grown. But that doesn't mean that I can always grow every capacity to whatever degree I want to grow it. Again, there is this thing called limits that we don't like in our humanness, but I think part of our character growth and our spiritual formation is accepting that God has created us as finite human beings, and that means, like it or not, we do have limits. So how do we live out our our capacity in a way that is honoring? Well, first of all, it's by acknowledging what I am capable of and then examining and saying, hey, am I being a faithful steward of those abilities or not? One of the reasons I'm here on this podcast is because it's a way of me being a good steward of my capacity to communicate, to read and study the Bible, to have insights that I can then turn around and share. The second part of capacity is acknowledging what I am not capable of and then saying, you know what? Do I need to work on developing that capacity, or do I need to accept that all the energy that I would direct into that arena would be better invested elsewhere? I love the underdog movies as much as anybody else. I'm not talking about the old cartoon Underdog, although I do remember that old cartoon. I don't know, maybe that's still streaming somewhere. But what I'm talking about are those movies where we see somebody who has to overcome tremendous odds and obstacles in order to achieve something that they really desire. And I could name some of those movies, but I might make some of you upset because you might be, what? No, I love that movie. So I'm not going to give any names, but you can think about this. And here's the plus side and then the downside of some of those kinds of movies and stories. The plus side is that it does help us to inspire us to see beyond what we have the capacity to do right now. It also can give us encouragement to say that we don't set limits on ourselves that are false limits. But there's also a downside. Sometimes we might want to ask the question, what if that person would have spent all that energy and maybe all those years even that they invested in trying to achieve that one goal? Was that really the best use of their time and their energy? Now, I'm not here to say it was or it wasn't. I don't think it's about that. I think it's about us asking ourselves that question. It's not about making that decision for others, but it's about having the honesty to ask ourselves, if we recognize that we do not have the capacity that we want to have, that we look at that and say, am I being lazy because I could grow this capacity and I and a lot of other people around me would be a lot better off if I did? Or do we sometimes need to accept that theology of limits and we need to say, I will be a better steward of my time and my abilities and my energy if I invest this elsewhere? Now, the second thing I want us to look at, and this is going to be pretty short, is that we see that part of a life of discipleship is trusting God to direct circumstances at key points in our life. It's likely, now I'm not saying there was, but I'm just saying, I think it's probably reasonable to think that in Jerusalem at this time period in Nehemiah, that there were people who were debating whether or not they should volunteer to go live in Jerusalem. They were probably having those discussions at home. They were probably weighing the pros and cons, and they might have just come to a point of saying, we honestly don't know what to do. We're willing to go and do that, but we don't absolutely know that we need to go and do that. And that is where God had provided this way through the casting of lots to be able to make some of those decisions for people. And so that was at a point where when people had done everything that they had the ability to do, that they could then just leave it in God's hands and say, okay, God, we've had all of our discussion. We've sought counsel. We have prayed about this. We have discussed this. We have tried to examine our own hearts. At this point in time, we really don't know whether there is a right and wrong, good, better, or best decision here. So we've done everything that we have the capacity to do, and we're not going to trust you with the outcome. And so maybe as those lots got rolled, maybe they weren't picked, and they could walk away and say, okay, God, then we know that this was not for us. And for other people, they could use that as a way to walk away and say, okay, God, that's then how you can make that decision. We want to be careful that we don't become weird about circumstances. We don't want to start seeing God behind every little thing in life in terms of, ooh, I got that parking lot space, or, ooh, that was on sale. I guess that means I need to buy it. We don't want to be weird about attributing just normal kind of life to God's divine intervention in everything that we do. But I do think that it shows us that there is a place that when we have done everything we can to get information, to seek wisdom, to ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance, and if we still don't have clarity about what to do, then we can add to these things or request that God direct our circumstances. It's not subtracting from our responsibilities, and it's not a replacement for our responsibilities. It's adding to this the humility that says, I don't know it all. And so at this point, God, I am going to ask that you add circumstances to everything else I'm doing to help direct my decisions. All right, well, that's going to wrap us up for today. And I am going to remind you again, if you're looking for a speaker for your women's ministry events and also for parenting events, for moms and dads, then check out my website, stephaniepresents.com. Make sure to sign up for High Impact while you are there. And I will see you next time. In the meantime, remember this, my friend. You have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.